Hello and welcome to ESL Revolution, everybody. I'm your content creator and professor, Dr. B. Welcome back to the channel. It is Saturday, March 28th here in Korea. But I was supposed to put a video yesterday on Friday KSAT, but to be quite honest, I was really tired. So I decided to wait until today to get this video out. And this is I think this is the fourth now. This is the fourth or fifth video, I believe, in the ESL tips and hints section of our YouTube channel. So today I want to go into that. I want to continue in some of the foundational elements of teaching and learning in Korea. So we've talked about cultural elements. We've talked about the difference between West and East in terms of how the mind is structured toward education. And I'm going to continue in this avenue today because in one of the articles I read in preparation for doing this, the author talked about this idea of speech is silver, silence is golden, and related that particular phrase, particular phrase, and related that to how Korean students function in a classroom. So used that example of basically saying, well, the reason why they're quiet is because they're doing the Confucian thing, and they are being honorific to the teacher, and this is the best way that Koreans know how to, in fact, study. However, today I'm going to take an exception to that, because I think that not only did the author use that phrase incorrectly, and also attributed it incorrectly, but I think also missed the nuance of that phrase quite dramatically in terms of what that represents for the individual student in the classroom. So let me be very clear up front. I do not believe that this quote ought to be used as kind of a theoretical foundation for silence in the classroom. In fact, this is not what that phrase means, and it ought not to be used in that particular context of a student literally just sitting there and taking notes, even if they know the answer, even if they understand the material, etc., etc. Whether that be in an English classroom or whether it be in another classroom where Korean is the primary mode of instruction. It really doesn't matter. Now, obviously, I am announcing my bias in this particular video, right? That's very clear, and I will be honest about that bias. And so that, you've got to take that with a grain, however you want to, one way or the other. So first of all, let's talk about that phrase in the first place. Now, the author, and I want to read this because I think it's an important idea. So I'm going to read this verbatim from what the author said. In order to sharpen their communicative skills, students should aggressively participate in class and group activities. In this vein, eloquence may be silver, silence is gold, is another major cultural barrier to the improvement of spoken English. For this reason, discussion, debate, group activities, and the interaction between students and teachers are difficult to be fully utilized. From their childhood, Korean students have never been taught to show off, quote, show off, and stand out from the group. A talkative person is characterized by a weightless person, especially if you are male. Especially if you are male, an old maxim dictates a word of honor is as good as a bond, prevails not only in the Korean society but also in the school system. Now, while there may be truth to what the author is saying, sorry, I'm just getting comfortable. While there may be some truth to what the author is saying, I think the first thing I want to talk about is this idea focused at the very first sentence: in order to sharpen their communicative skills, students should aggressively participate in class. Students don't need to be aggressive whatsoever in order to participate in a class. They can be there, they can interact, but it doesn't need to be aggressive. One can engage with, and one can, engage with the language and be involved. But the idea of an aggressiveness in the classroom, I think, actually gives his bias away, gives the author's bias away as to how the Korean student ought to be behaving in order to learn English language. And that is simply not the case. I've had many instances in my last 15 years being in Korea where students are not aggressive in their language acquisition, but they are learning. So let's put little parentheses around that for a moment. Let me move on. In this vein, eloquence may be silver, silence is gold, is another major cultural barrier to the improvement of spoken English. Maybe not. So, first of all, I think that the author is trying to connect this phrase, eloquence may be silver, silence is gold, and kind of take that phrase and place it on top of this Confucian excuse me, this Confucian identity. I get something stuck in my throat right in the middle of my video recording. I'm not going to edit it out, so don't even worry about it. Sorry about that. So they're trying to take this idea and kind of stick it to this idea of the Confucian idea that you don't want to stand out. If you're in a classroom, you don't want to be the person that is always asking questions. You don't want to be the person who is correcting another student for what they did or didn't do properly in the classroom. Now, there may be times when that is appropriate, but in an educational setting, and again, I'm going to, this is my bias coming into the video, of course, that an educational setting, an environment, is not one where you passively receive the information. All right? That has been, that is very much a part of a European Enlightenment type of idea. We talked about, or perhaps we didn't, but this idea of tabula rasa, blank slate, where the students are simply empty vessels and it's the teacher's right and role to simply fill up the vessel with information that is to be provided, and at a certain point the education is over because the vessel, i.e. my brain, has filled up with the appropriate amount of information. Well, this has been proven time and time again to really not be a particularly valuable way of educating an individual. We know that information is important, of course, but that is only one part of the educational process. The use of and the application of that knowledge is extremely important. So it doesn't matter how much knowledge you have. If it's not being utilized, it's worthless. If it's not being utilized, it is worthless. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if an individual is in 5th grade and can do university level trigonometry. Why? 1, they're not at university. And 2, they're showing off. Now, this is the catch-22 that I've kind of picked out in this particular argument. The idea that people should not show off. Well, there is a phrase in Korea, and I might have this wrong, but omachingu is the phrase. And basically it relates to my mom's friend. And this is one of the aspects of showing off that in fact is very, very culturally rich in Korea. And in fact goes against this very idea of showing off in Confucian culture. Now, what does this mean? This means that if I'm doing something with my kids in a way of educating my kids, and because I'm educating, and I don't mean my kids particularly, but I just mean me as generic me, that I'm doing something and it's been proven to work because the grades are getting higher. Then what I do is I go tell my other mom's friend about how good my son or daughter is doing. And then that mom tells their daughter or son, why aren't you doing as good as they? Why aren't your grades higher than my friend's mom's kids, right? So the moms are in fact doing exactly the opposite of what's going on here, of this idea of showing off. So there's that catch-22 in the classroom, in the culture that is widespread, and it is an issue whereby, eloquence may be silver, silence is gold. That isn't even being followed. So the use of this phrase to map on top of the Korean education system is actually, in my opinion, basically. It's a way of propping up an existing cultural framework that, in my opinion, radically needs to change. And this idea that Korean students have been taught to never show off, well, that's interesting. Why is it then that as parents, as those kids get older, they want to show off their kids? Why is that? Now, I'm not going to answer that, but I am going to leave that as a thought for you. Maybe you want to put a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Now, the other reason, I guess this is the third reason now, why I believe that this phrase, eloquence may be silver, silence is gold, is actually a completely inappropriate metaphor for the Korean education system, because it wasn't coined by a Korean, and it's not Confucian. And so because of that reason, we need to unpack what that phrase actually alludes to and whether or not, after unpacking it, does it fit the Korean context? The answer is no and no, but let me explain. Now, I'm going to use an article here to explain. This is by Melanie Bailey, and she's part of the LinkedIn organization, and it's this. So okay. So first of all, let me explain the historic background of this phrase. First of all, it is often in English, the English phrase is often attributed to a poet by the name of Thomas Carlyle. And he translated this from German in 1831. Okay, so I'm looking at my notes here. So we know that already because of the date of this particular phrase, that silence is silver is speech, silence is golden. That there's no cultural connection between Anglo-German and Confucian Korea. Okay, there's nothing there. So that's the first thing that leads me to believe that the writer simply just took this phrase and dumped it into the Korean context as a way of explaining away the classroom silence. Now, this phrase, the second part of this phrase does not indicate that one should always remain silent. Yeah. This has to do with knowing when silence is important and when speaking out is important. Okay, let me rephrase. Or let me quote. The proverb likens the idea that gold is more precious than silver in the same way that discretion is more precious than even the most eloquent remark. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is undoubtedly a valuable communication tool. So, the author then, Melanie Bailey, is saying that there is something effective about staying silent in particular occasions, but at the same time, providing speech when it is warranted. However, there's much more involved in the successful let me rephrase that. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is undoubtedly a valuable communication tool. However, there's much more involved in the successful exchange of information. It's not just about choosing the right words or the right place for prudence. The most valuable skill includes clear messages, active listening, and ensuring mutual understanding. Maybe it's time to update the proverb so that it reflects what we know today. Speech is silver, silence is golden, effective communication is platinum. Now, that's a direct quote out of this article, and in fact, I'm going to link this article into the comments below so you can read it for yourself. Now, what is this saying? Well, it's indicating, first of all, that this idea, speech is silver, silence is golden, and having that kind of placed on top of the Korean foundation of education as another example of the reason why students are silent is in fact erroneous, because those two cultural aspects are completely different. We're talking about the heart of the Enlightenment philosophical movement in Europe and Confucian Korea, ne'er the two shall meet. That's the first thing. The second thing is that what they might have understood communication to be in 1831 does not help us in 2020. That there is some aspect of remaining quiet, but being quiet does not mean being passive. Being quiet does not mean being passive. In fact, it's the exact opposite. We ought to be actively listening. And in the classroom, Korean classroom, active listening is not a part of that classroom culture. So when something is being said, you ask us, what? Because they're just, they're off. They look like they're listening, but in actual fact, they're not. So speech is silver, silence is golden, effective communication is platinum. Communication requires minimal effort. Bailey continues. Minimal effort. Effective communication requires intention and discipline. Communication is simply an exchange of information, but effective communication requires comprehension of the information being exchanged. Let me say that again. Communication is simply an exchange of information, but effective communication requires comprehension of the information being exchanged. Now, this to me goes back to what the original author was saying. This idea that students should aggressively participate in class. Now, when we take these two quotes and put them side by side, it is true that effective communication requires comprehension of the information being exchanged. Ergo, I, the speaker, need to be aware of my audience and communicate to that level. And furthermore, the audience needs to be engaged in that active listening and respond back when questions are warranted. There's nothing there about aggressiveness in the classroom on the face of the teacher or on the face of the student. Okay? So I hope that in this little exchange, we're beginning to see that the classroom dynamic is so fundamentally different from the way that this Korean author is talking about this context. Let me continue here. Effective communication involves interpersonal connection. There is a huge thing right there, interpersonal connection. I, as a teacher, cannot effectively communicate if I do not create a relationship with my students first in some way, shape, or form. Now, that way of connecting is going to be different for every teacher out there. For me, I tend to be a little bit more over the top in my dramatic movements and my vocal tones, and I get students to laugh. And you know what? That begins to create the relationship. Why? Because laughter makes people relaxed. So that's my way of doing it. It may not work for you. That's okay. No worries. It doesn't matter. But find a way that you can do that, and that will be helpful. Effective communication involves interpersonal connection. Communication is making something known. Effective communication is knowing how to interpret emotion and body language, clearly and articulately express a message, be engaged and active listener, use your own body language appropriate, and achieve mutual understanding. Now that's a lot, okay? Sure, communication is just, I say something, the other person understands. They say something, I understand. That's the basics of communication, but that's not everything about communication. And therefore, we have to be engaging our students in something very, very different. And we have to pull our students out of the idea that somehow silence is golden, because that is not going to help them. Now, it might help students in a Korean context in 1992. But in reality, we're in the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen. We are at the edge. We are at the beginning right now of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And the Fourth Industrial Revolution, 4IR, is going to demand so much more of the people that are engaged in that cultural zeitgeist. There is so much more that is being asked of our students, and yet we as teachers are not giving it to them. Why? Because they still think that silence is golden. They still think that being respectful and honorable in the classroom is by not saying anything at all. I think it's very important that we dissolve that idea in our students as best as we can. We're not going to be perfect at it by any stretch. We are not going to be perfect at it. And not all students are going to be attuned to that. But If we do that, if we begin to show them that university, and in this case I'm going to use that as my example, that university must operate at a completely different level. It is not me simply just providing the students information and thereby they are learning. No. The fourth industrial revolution is going to chew those people up and spit them out, unfortunately. And those are the individuals that are going to have the biggest problem with this new economic and social model. And as a teacher, that's what I want the students to understand. That they need to be considering what happens 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Because if I don't do my job now, they are going to fail in the future. And I don't want that to happen. Let me continue here with this this article here. Effective communication is a skill. It can be learned and enhanced with practice. So why settle for silver and gold when platinum is within your grasp? See, that's so interesting. If you're already sitting there because silence is gold and you're already doing the Korean thing, you're at the gold level. But why not level up, folks? Why not take that one step further? Platinum is much more rare a metal than gold ever was. Think about that for a second. Now, here's a great quote that I really like. You can have brilliant ideas, but if you can't get them across, your ideas won't get you anywhere. And that's the problem here. That if you have an idea in my classroom or in any classroom and you're not giving that idea out, the idea doesn't matter. It is worthless because all you're doing is keeping it in your head. And what is that going to get you? Probably nothing and nowhere, unfortunately. And this is where you really need to make sure that that you kind of get rid of those ideas. You are in university now. We ought to expect more from our university students, regardless of their skill level, regardless of what has come after. We need to not be an extension of elementary, middle school, and high school, but we should raise them up to be something more. The fourth industrial revolution is going to change everything in our culture over the next 15 or 20 years. Do we want our students to simply be thrown away, husks of the third industrial revolution that are no longer required? Or do we need to do something more as English teachers now here in Korea? And it doesn't matter what level of education we are working at. Elementary, middle school, high school. We all have value in bringing something new to that environment. Yes, it is an EFL environment. Yes, they may or may not go to another country to study for 6 months or a year or 2 years and live and embed within another culture. But there is something that we can teach them that goes beyond just language. Creativity, critical thinking, evaluation. Those are all skills that we as foreign teachers, because that's the way we've been trained, we can bring that to their classroom and help them understand that those modes of learning will be invaluable for their future. All right. There are other things here that I could talk to, but I don't want to take up too much time because I've probably gone on for 20-25 minutes by now. But let me just go back to the original article here. Let me just see. Okay, so one of the things that this author, he quotes actually from research in 1994, children in such societies, and in this they're talking about kind of more collectivist communities, Children in such societies are less likely to be asked to formulate and share their opinions or to talk about what they are learning in school. Now, this is interesting. Let me read that again. Children in such societies, like Korea, are less likely to be asked to formulate and share opinions or talk about what they are learning in school. Now, this is really interesting, and this goes back to that foundation of education. Why is it that students are not being asked to formulate opinions? Is it that we simply want the students to remain silent? If they have opinions, they might be eager to share them? This is not going to be helpful in a 4IR world, ladies and gentlemen. It just simply won't. We need to change the way that we as teachers function, and this goes for native teachers as well as Korean teachers. Okay? The role of sharing opinions and knowledge is reserved for people with higher status. Well, that is a uniquely Confucian idea for sure, if I ever heard one. But here's the thing. Education makes you higher status automatically because you're being educated. Education is one of the barriers to status. If, in the old world, you were not educated, you were low-born. If you are educated, you are higher-born. You, ladies and gentlemen, are going to university. That makes you part of that higher class. To speak in Confucian phrases, mind you. So, if you consider yourself to be if you're at university and you are being educated, you ought to be using your opinions. You ought to be sharing your education with other people, and your knowledge is there not just to be self-serving. Knowledge is there to be used for the betterment of your culture. This mentality, as the article goes on, permeates every fabric of Korean society combined with Confucianism. The school system is not an exception. Just listening to teachers respectfully in class without expressing their opinions is a norm in the Korean education system. The collectivist orientation also extends to notions of peer review, since it's a kind of mutual admiration. I'm not going to get into that right now. Just listening to teachers respectfully in class without expressing their opinions is a norm in the Korean education system. Yes, it is. No, it shouldn't be. Yes, I'm biased because I am coming from a Western framework, but one can learn to be respectful and still share opinions simultaneously. How we do that? That, ladies and gentlemen, is for another video. Anyway, this is Dr. B from ESL Revolution. I hope this has been thought-provoking and conversation-provoking. If you have anything to say, put a message down in the comments below. I will be happy to get back to you once I see those. Stay safe, everybody. Stay healthy during the tail end of this coronavirus. I hope to see you soon in class. And remember, be the revolution. Peace.